Hello and welcome. I'm Jim Tolles. I'm a spiritual teacher, as many of you know. I blog regularly at spiritualawakeningprocess.com, and I've been doing so for more than 7 years. Tonight's topic in this free live stream is living and transforming in energy flow. I'll be talking a little bit about what energy flow is, what it's not, what it means to identify flow versus guessing. I think a lot of people are doing a lot of guessing and I'm very clear about those things. For those who are new, there should be a chat pod that you can type in questions, and I ask that you keep the questions directed to me and have them be respectful. And of course, please ask only a couple at a time. It's such a small space that if we have a lot of people with a lot of questions and one person just rambles the entire time, then we could lose somebody's important questions. So if you feel like you have a lot to ask me, you can email me, and you can just go to spiritualawakeningprocess.com and there's a contact form. But otherwise, I encourage you to think about the thing that you really, really want to ask. What's the most important question to you, and to use that. And before I dive into this too much, I also have an ebook for anyone who's new to me. It's called Everyday Spirituality, Cultivating an Awakening. You can find it on Amazon. And you can subscribe to my blog to receive notifications when there are new posts, as well as subscribing to my newsletter, which I offer other thoughts and recommended blog posts that I've written in the past through that. Finally, these talks are always free, but donations are appreciated. And I do them every 2 weeks, alternating between 6 p.m. Pacific time and 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. The reason is just because we live in an international world now here on the internet. So the 10:30 a.m. is nice for Europe, and the 6 p.m. is nice for everyone who's working here in the U.S. and for people over on the Pacific Rim. For those as you're logging on, if you just want to leave a quick little message about where you are, it's kind of fun to see where everybody is in regards to how international this is. And let's get going. Living and transforming in energy flows. So what do I even mean by energy flow? Energy flow is kind of that divine movement within us that seems to guide us and move us in whatever way is truthful to our paths. Now you notice I said truthful to our paths. I didn't say easy. I didn't say enjoyable. I didn't say comfortable. And I think that's always such a big thing to understand, that living a life that matters to us doesn't mean we're living an easy life. And I think so often we get caught up in the search for ease. And that really informs a lot of people's ideas about what they think energy flow even is. For many people, flowing means the path of least resistance. It means whatever is the easiest thing to do. It means they're getting the things that their ego thinks they should want. And I think those are the three most common ways that people look at energy flow. There's a real downside to that, of course, because some of our most important lessons in life, some of our most important triumphs and joys and rewards come when things are often difficult. And some people will be called towards very challenging paths in life just because they're called to them. And that's not wrong if something's difficult. It's just difficult. And the true inner flow flows into that difficulty, can flow through it, sometimes flows around it. And through that flow, we continue to transform as people, because as a human being, the human being is constantly changing. We can be engaged in our ongoing transformations, or we can be passive, and it's really up to us. And by engagement embraces rest as much as it embraces action. So I want you to really see that those two things are paired. It's kind of a yin yang thing, but the way a lot of people kind of think about flowing too is often very passive. It's just like, oh, I just kind of lay back and everything comes to me. No, it's not that at all. And certainly with difficult moments, like you don't just kind of lay back and, whatever happens is what happens. Sometimes we have to be more actively engaged with what's going on. Otherwise, you get the rise of dictatorships. There are plenty of dictators who are happy to let you just be passive and say, well, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And lo and behold, you have Hitler or Mussolini or all sorts of very, very mean people, to say the least, who will happily take power when you are surrendering your ability to be actively engaged. So passivity is not part of the discussion of the flow. Anybody who thinks that just passively flowing along and things come to them, if that's what's working in your life, you're very blessed. And I really, really have to emphasize how blessed Westerners are in general. Any of you who are sitting here listening now are extraordinarily blessed with stable internet, electricity, a computer of some kind, whether you're seeing it at a coffee shop or you're sitting at home. And computer, of course, includes phones now, which are computers. I mean, so many gifts have already been given to us. It's extraordinary. So it's pretty easy for a lot of things to show up in our lives because there's already so much available to us. So I think that's an aspect that every Westerner needs to appreciate, right? This wealth that we live in and we take for granted. We take for granted roads. A lot of people take for granted having cars. I mean, you can rewind the clock 100 years and a lot of what we're using right now does not exist. So you can't really flow into it because it's not there. So coming back to the topic of what is this flow, this intelligence? This is the divine that moves through all of us. It's kind of like the deeper ocean currents that guide and inform everything else. And the more we drop into them and surrender to them, they do move us. And surrendering to that is not passive. It's saying, okay, I acknowledge this movement. When is it asking me to do something? When is it asking me to allow it more deeply, to follow it? And that's such an amazing dance. Two of the main kinds of flow that in some ways are different or in some ways are very much the same, the awakened flow and just the general energy flow that's accessible to all of us. And I want to make a distinction that after a spiritual awakening, this flow kind of does the person. It's not voluntary. It has nothing to do with a person's spiritual practice or even if they think they're spiritual. When somebody's energy awakens, it moves them. And this typically moves the people through a lot of purging because we are holding on to so many attachments. So that becomes what starts to get moved out of someone. And it kind of seems like after a couple of years, if somebody's really engaged with a spiritual awakening, it moves like a key block, some sort of cornerstone in this river of their life that had to go. It doesn't get rid of all the blocks, all the rocks and all the twigs and all the debris inside someone. It just seems to find the thing that needs to go the most, and it moves it. And that allows somebody who's had a spiritual awakening in the way that I described, and keep in mind, I'm very specific, and it's very different than how a lot of the people talk about spiritual awakening. Then things keep moving on their own. And sometimes there's times that are easier and other times less so. But it doesn't ever really stop because that's not the nature of the human experience. The human experience, as I said, is change. Even as we're in that space of stillness that's never changing, a space of oneness from which we observe all this change, all this other change arises, and it can arise very intelligently. And that's one of the essential parts of the awakened energies. It's exceptionally intelligent. And there's a way that we learn to listen to it for those of us who've had spiritual awakenings. Even after all this work, we may be called to do more inner work at different times, and other times we're called to let that go and to just rest and allow things to move through us and to show up in life. And it doesn't matter if anything's achieved either. In a Western society that really focuses a lot on we have to achieve different things, this is a completely different mindset. It's not a mindset in that way at all. It has no interest in achievements. There's just a natural way of moving. In the same way there's a natural way that an apple tree grows. It just kind of wants to grow in a certain way. It feels kind of like it's a DNA sort of decision where you don't necessarily have a lot of choice over it. However, that's not entirely true when it comes to the awakened flow, because we certainly could do all kinds of things to make ourselves unconscious before, and we can still do those now. But the awareness that has expanded so we can see more helps you to understand the costs of doing such a thing. And it's important to mention that those people who have moved through that key block that had to go, that on top of all the other issues that get moved, because it's not just like it's one thing, but as I said, there's something about awakened energy that it wants to move just enough so that it can keep moving and keep moving the person. And that doesn't mean somebody's reached total enlightenment with no attachments to anything. That's a pretty rare thing, and it doesn't usually happen after the initial awakening. And somebody usually has to want it, but in a certain degree too, that energy within them has to want that too. That this has to be kind of part of their path, that yes, I'm going to flow in this way, I'm going to move towards that total surrender. I'm not a believer that anybody has to move towards that. I'm more of a believer in the sense that there's an intelligence inside you that already knows whether that's a direction that's something your soul wants. And the more you listen to how these inner nudges are nudging you, sometimes more insistently and sometimes much quieter, the more things just keep evolving, keep transforming within you and in your life. And you stay an engaged, active part of the life that's going on within you and around you. But since the spiritual awakening is such a rare thing, it's also important to just talk about energy flow that is always there, regardless of if there's this extra push. For those that haven't had a spiritual awakening, you have to really want to look for it, and that starts by letting go of more attachments of the ego. Because your ego attachments are going to constantly redivert your attention towards whatever it is you were taught to believe was important and you should want for yourself and in life. And that is often not in the flow of what really matters to your spirit. As many of you know, I talk about inner work all the time, and I'm going to talk about it again, because if we don't dissolve these attachments, you will not want to listen to anything else. You're too busy believing that the ego self is correct. It knows what it wants and knows how to get the things it wants. And that's one of those really lessons that when those of us who had an awakening have learned, is like, wow, I really have no idea what I actually want, what actually matters to me. And then you have to really be dedicated to investigating, because otherwise you will go back to your original patterns. Without the pressure of something to force you to look at those patterns, you will just go back to the old ones, particularly if you feel like you get something you want. And this is why it was so important that I established at the beginning of this talk, this isn't just the easy way in life. This isn't the path of least resistance. This isn't about getting all the ego things you think you want. We come back to this space of true fulfillment within us. And the true fulfillment is that space of the witness, because it's always full. It's never lacking anything. In a strange way, it's also always empty, where there's this sense of nothingness. And so you have this amazingly beautiful paradox of being full of emptiness. And there's nothing wrong in that space ever. And from that space, transformation wants to happen. From that space, it gets easier to pay attention to what is moving in life within you. You can start to focus on it. So for many of you, life is very loud. And what do I mean by loud? Well, we can just think of advertisements on television and everything else, right? It's shouting at you for attention. And most of our ego beliefs are shouting at us with judgments and self-worth issues and goals and timeless or time schedules and lists and right. And all these different things are shouting, and they drown out these quieter things. Because unless something is desperately needed for you to know in the moment, it doesn't seem like God shouts at us too often. Unfortunately, until we feel like the divine is shouted at us, we're not really willing to pay attention. So what's a shout? It's like a near-death experience. It's the death of a loved one. It's cancer. That's right. It's something that's, puts our life in jeopardy or somebody else's life in jeopardy. Something has to shake somebody up badly enough, usually. And it has to be really, really strong before they should say, hey, maybe I don't know what I'm doing in this life. And it can go the other way, where somebody who's been avoiding things, right? They've been passive and just trying to do the least that they have to and just kind of skate along through society. And life finally pushes them and says, no, you have to stand up for yourself. You have to do things now. You have to do the things you already know you need to do. And when God steps down with that big heavy boot on our chests, we start to do a little. And the minute that pressure goes away, then people usually stop. And so we'll go back to the patterns. So this is what I'm getting towards, is that the ego is a pattern. It's not a flow. Even when it seems like we're doing things, usually it's more like we're on a racetrack going around the same loop over and over and over again, having the same types of experiences. Because the ego is just telling you the same stories, and you're acting out the same stories, and other people are doing the same thing. And so around and around we go, doing the same types of things over and over again. We're not changing, really. We're just growing old, not really living. We're just filling up space. So we have to really, really be dedicated. We have to really, really be willing to go inside and to be into some spaces of amazing discomfort inside. And as we do that, as we start to find out that we can, and that we can open ourselves to greater levels of freedom and love and clarity and humility and compassion, that starts to become the inspiration to continue. Where pain is usually what gets people started, these other things start to be the inspiration to continue, and they should be. Because we need to go beyond just being forced into taking positive action for ourselves. When you start to have these senses of what love is pointing us towards, love in a much deeper sense than just, pleasurable experiences with other people. That's an aspect of the flow. It starts to say, this is something that calls to you. And it gets easier to hear our intuition when our ego isn't the only thing we pay attention to, and we're learning to let it go and to let go of attachments. We start to say, oh, wow, there's this little nudge to go in this direction, and then we start to follow it. And we often follow these intuitions without knowing any idea why we're going in that direction. A lot of times with intuition, we don't really figure out why we did something until later. And intuition, and I've talked about this in so many other talks and on my blog, it's not just about a feeling, it's a knowing. It's before any physical feelings of whether this feels good or whether it feels bad. Because whether something feels good or feels bad is primarily coming through your ego lens of whether you think you're going to benefit from it or you're going to be hurt by it. And a lot of times that lens is wrong, because sometimes the things we think will feel good don't. And sometimes the things we think will hurt us actually strengthen us. So we really learn to go beyond the feeling of intuition towards the knowing. And I find that the intuitive knowing is very much part of the energetic flow of just this way to navigate life. to move towards things that truly, truly matter to us in a way that's beyond words. And it's so important to give us that space to go beyond our initial rational mind and what we've been taught to believe, because what we've been taught to believe is going to vary person to person, and it's usually pretty limited. In Western society, we're taught to really value, to some degree, our health, but actually I think we don't value that enough. I think above that is usually being in a relationship and having a job. And then after that, maybe purpose, and then maybe our health. Because if you look at a lot of Americans, we don't really take care of ourselves particularly well. Some of us obviously do, but there are a lot of really big health epidemics, and our bodies are getting sacrificed for these ego achievements that we think we're supposed to have. So part of coming into flow will be sacrificing ego achievements. And that, of course, is stepping you outside what the culture is telling you you should do. And that can be surprising at times. Some of the big changes people have to make. Let's refer to the person who's being too passive of their life. Some of those big changes that they may have to make may fly in the face of these other ideas about what it means to be productive or to have goals or to have a career. Sometimes the flow can be very helpful in the sense that if there's a conflict with the ego, right, then that starts to help you get a sense of like, oh, this is a different thing, right? It's saying I should go in this direction, even though my ego is saying, no, I should go in this other one. And there's that sort of friction actually gives you some illumination. But as I said earlier, a lot of times the flow is much quieter than that, so it's not going to be shouting at you. It doesn't make you do things. I think that's a big thing. Intuition and this energy flow, this divine flow within all of you, it usually doesn't tell you you have to do anything. The things that tell you you have to do something, you're going to be hurt, or you'll get what you want, that's usually the ego. So doing this inner work allows you to listen to these quieter conversations that you all have access to. It's so important to do this inner work. I just can't emphasize over and over again that without consistency, unless you have an awakening that's just pushing you through it all, and even then you have to engage with it to really, really benefit from it, from my experience. But if you don't actively engage, say, yes, I'm going to really push these edges of myself and to explore my mind, my heart, my body, my energy, you're just going to stay in whatever your basic program is from childhood. And that's just how we are. That we learned a bunch of core ways of feeling and thinking and interacting from childhood. That's the base program. Everything else is built on that foundation, and that defines what we can be and what we can't be. And all of you are so much more than that program. Are those initial programs from childhood bad? No. There's just building a child and building a person over time. But we're all adults now, I would assume. And we can make different choices if we want to. The transformations we go through don't necessarily have to be anything particularly big as well. That's also an ego idea. So you don't have to transform into some amazing spiritual master or, working with everybody around the world. You just transform into you. This is why I love plant metaphors. And if we think of, being trapped in the seed of the ego, right, the ego shell, the pumpkin plant doesn't need to become a redwood tree. The redwood tree doesn't need to become an aspen. Right? They just become what they already are, and they grow in their own way, and they grow in their own cycles. And it's such a beautifully personal journey. And not everybody is going to be in easy situations for their growth. I mean, this is another reason why this plant metaphor is wonderful. If you go out to the mountains, wherever there are mountains close to you, and particularly the really, really tall mountains, there's some trees that landed in some very rocky, crappy soil, and yet somehow they've grown. But they've grown based on what the situation allowed them. So I bring this up because consider if you're in a war-torn country, what's going to be possible for your growth. Some of our environment is going to determine how we can flow. And there's something about this flow that's very intelligent towards like how it's going to move through the environment that it's in. If you put it in a slightly different environment, it has different supports and may flow differently, and that's fine too. So if you've got a pine tree at a lower altitude, growing like 200 feet, and you have a pine tree at a higher altitude, and it's growing like 20 feet, right? Because it's just not much to use. But they're both perfect. They're both pine trees. Right? The pine tree that landed in the rockier soil has not failed in its ability to be a pine tree. But I just think this becomes a problem when we start to think about transformation, because the ego starts to run in with its ideas of this, and it's like, well, I should look like this. I should look like the yoga body, or I should be able to levitate, or all these shoulds start coming out. And anytime a should shows up, you should know that the ego is hanging around. Living daily life isn't really a big deal. So being in the flow doesn't mean we're checking in every moment of every day to figure out, am I flowing right now? It's more like you just live. And a lot of transformations just kind of build up piecemeal over time and through some of these little nudges. Every now and then there's a bigger decision that shows up, and that's fine. But I also am concerned about Western mentalities to look towards those big moments, the big aha moments. And that's a blog post I wrote recently. And you may want to check that out. It's called Waiting for a Big Aha Spiritual Moment. I think it's still on the main page of spiritualawakeningprocess.com, and you can read about that. Because when we think something should be large like that, then we're missing out on a lot of smaller present moments that usually build up to large things. It's this idea of like little grains of sand that, over time, if you stack them together, pretty soon you have a sand castle. And if you keep stacking, you could have a huge castle. So a lot of the flow seems to draw us more towards a gradual understanding of nature and transformation and change. And at the same time, it still embraces destruction, that things fall apart. We get old. Things break down. They have to be repaired. There's nothing wrong with that. Getting sick doesn't mean you failed in your spiritual path. Getting cancer doesn't mean you failed in your spiritual path. I'm deeply concerned about a lot of ideas out there that somehow if anything bad happens to us, we've done something wrong spiritually. Bodies break down. We do the best we can, but things break down. And then we do the best we can, and we flow through that. We flow through cancer, and we flow through sickness, and we flow through broken bones in whatever way we need to. And generally speaking, the flow does make things easier when we surrender to it, because we know what we can do, and we do it. And we appreciate what we can't do. And so we allow it to be as it is. And there's such a wonderful peace that comes from that. And while we don't know everything, right, this isn't about understanding everything going on. Something about staying in the present moment helps us to know the things we need to when we need to know them. The flow doesn't, help us to know everything in the future, because that's not how it is. I mean, at best, people who are particularly psychic understand and can sense possibilities. Possibilities aren't certainties. So the beauty of this flow is it embraces how things change. The certain possibilities come into our life and become our reality, and then other things flow out. And so in the terms of the body, somebody was a full-bodied, able person, then they got in a bad car wreck and lost an arm, right? They've now changed. That reality of having lost a limb is part of their life. So now they flow with that. What does that mean? How do they navigate life having lost a limb? And the most important transformations that continue are the dissolution of the ego, so that these deeper forms of love and kindness, awareness, compassion can emerge and shape you. They're very, very powerful forces when we surrender to them. And as we surrender and we see how they call to us, they reshape us. So you could have somebody who's surrendered their selfishness. They've been a miser and they've been just caught up in the business world their whole lives and they're surrendering it. And then there's this nudge to go to a homeless shelter one day. They have no idea why. It's just one day. It's not like in the middle of the holidays. There's no reason for it. There's just some part of them says, I should go there. And they do. And then they become a regular volunteer for several years. And then they take over as an executive director one day. Right? And these little moments build up through these little callings. Right? This person didn't immediately jump to the conclusion, oh, I should transform my life and become an executive director overnight. And I see a lot of people trying to make these big jumps without honoring their process, honoring this flow inside that wants to show them how things want to evolve. I think these are some initial thoughts. So this is a good time to write any questions you may have into the little chat pod, and I'll respond to them. As I said earlier, please keep them directed to me and be the most important question you have. And if you have lots of questions, you can always message me through spiritualawakeningprocess.com. I have a contact page. This talk is free, but if you do feel called to donate, there's a donation link down below. And my work is entirely run by donations. And I'm deeply appreciative because I've been able to do this for so many years. So there's a comment from Amanda. She says, hi, Jim. Have you ever had self-healing? I experienced some amazing healing through meditation a few weeks ago. I'm now on an amazing spiritual journey. It depends what you mean by self-healing. I mean, certainly letting go of the ego and the old attachments makes space for a lot of healing. A lot of our different emotional ailments and even some of our physical ailments are linked into the ego self. That the ego is trying to hold on and be this person, right? So one of the interesting aspects of the ego tends to be fairly static. Even people who think they're free-flowing are actually pretty static in their understanding of themselves, because the free-flowing person doesn't allow themselves to be a more disciplined person. The true flow allows you to be in the free-flowing or the discipline depending on what the situation needs. So if there's a way you could kind of clarify what you mean by self-healing, Amanda, I can talk more about that. In general, I talk about healing a lot on the spiritual path, and healing from self-worth issues, healing from scarcity issues, and all the different ways those things manifest in our lives. We live in a very scared society. Everybody's trying to be somebody, to achieve something, to be beautiful, to be smart, to be rich. And there's a lot of unhappiness. And it's such a beautiful thing that as we drop more into the energy flow, that happiness often kind of shows up on its own for no reason. And that can kind of throw people for a loop for a while. We're like, wow, why am I feeling so good? It's like we're not used to unconditional love. We're not used to happiness spontaneously arising. And that can definitely happen in the energy flow that I'm talking about tonight, this divine flow, because it's not taking offense with what life is giving it. Because even when life throws rocks and bricks and stones into this flow, into the river never throws them back. It never says, nope, you can't put that branch in my river. But we do that all the time, of course. Oh, you gave me the wrong food that I ordered, right? I'll take it back. I don't want this food. You're talking to a spouse or a loved one, and they don't give you the compliment you want, or they give you criticism. You're like, oh, I don't want this criticism. Take it back. It's amazing how many different things we're so quick to reject. And the flow doesn't reject anything. living that space of total acceptance as part of true divine flow. Acceptance of whatever is here, whatever has arisen. Because if something's arisen, then it's here, and to reject it is kind of absurdity, isn't it? It's already happened, whatever it is. The car wreck, the criticism, the breakup, all these things that people don't want to accept. It's already happened. So trying to reject it is insane. And will only cause us more pain because this is part of our new reality. The human experience will continue to change. Let me know if you have any questions or other thoughts that you'd like to ask tonight. I see we have some people from Mexico and Washington State. Welcome. It really is a brand new thing to be in this flow and to see how it transforms you over time. We're used to following rules and becoming the things we're taught to be. It's like if you go to school, right, you're taught a certain way and you're told when you can graduate. And it's such a different thing to be evolved through love, through service, through compassion, and to see what relationships open up, what different aspects, different talents in you open up that perhaps you didn't even realize were there. So this is part of the transformation. You start to see more and more of these aspects of yourself that were kind of off limits or invisible before. I think it's particularly true for those of you who have awakened, and just the way that this thing keeps moving itself, intelligently opening you and expanding you to be able to embrace more and more of life unconditionally is really extraordinary. Hello, Australia. So a little comment there. I really feel like humanity is so novice in understanding how love evolves us, how compassion evolves us. We can point to all sorts of technology that we're creating, but in some regards, that's just child's play. It's like, okay, so we're just building off of old knowledge. It's like, what's the point of this technology? What is the purpose of it? Sometimes people ask me, but what do I think about social media? And I think it's great, but that's because of how I'm using it as a tool, right? The flow, the awakened awareness within me uses these things in certain ways. And so that has certain impacts. And for me, it's, to help people, to be of service. And things expand and evolve out of it in ways that I can't possibly imagine. And so tonight, we have people in Mexico and Washington State and Australia, right, that this can reach out and can touch. This is not something I would have imagined 10 years ago. I think live streaming has only really gotten popular in the last 3 or 4. I can only imagine what will evolve within me and what will evolve through technology in a couple of years, and what I will be able to do and I'll be able to engage with people at even deeper levels. For the awakened teacher like myself, and for those who may follow that path, there is an extraordinary power within us to help reshape people, to help them return to their natural state and to grow from that naturalness. And that's really all I'm talking about with the energy flows. It's returning us to this sort of natural way of behaving that has gotten squelched or forgotten or twisted by lots of ego ideas. For those who are just joining, if you have a question, feel free to ask in the chat pod. There's a lot of beauty in this flow. Beauty just simply from the sense of the clarity, the ease, the lack of self-judgment, the ability to be with people wherever they are. All right, so just as I was mentioning, we don't reject the difficult things that come, but we also have space for other levels of connection because we're not rejecting them. We're not saying this isn't what I want. And so many of relationships are never even allowed to begin because the person's ego or both people's egos have decided that the other person doesn't look like something they want. So that flow stops. And I actually get more of these stories from more than a few people of, there's this other person and just something has drawn them together. And yet maybe the situation doesn't allow for the few ways of relating that they know of. And many people have very limited ideas of what relationships can be and what love can look like. But there are amazing depths of love that can be had simply in friendship. I certainly experience a lot of amazing love as a teacher with my students. I don't think that relationship is particularly well known, how deep a student and a teacher can go together. There's a lot of naive ideas around deep love having to be sexual or romantic, and that's not true. That's just one flavor of ice cream in the ice cream store of love. So I can't say how any individual will transform. I can only encourage you to keep listening. But the more you listen, the more you pay attention, the more you let go of your ego, you will start to notice things. Sometimes the flow is not really hidden at all. It can be rather obvious, just simple. For instance, a lot of people are just called to be parents, and they're already parents right now. So it's like the path is already laid out before you. Don't reject what's here thinking it's not spiritual enough. I think that's another real big problem with a lot of people. They get these ideas of what spiritual flow should mean or look like, and then they reject the present moment, which is precisely the opposite of the spiritual path, which is to embrace everything as is. So motherhood or fatherhood has found you, embrace it. This is where life is taking you, embrace it. Learn to flow with your children. See what that's like. And parenting for sure will transform you. And then that cycle will close and something else will open. Our active parenting ends, children grow up. The flow engages all of life. It allows for these cycles of change. So another aspect here is it's not static. Like the ego is a static thing. As I mentioned earlier, even when it's growing really fast, trying to be protective around the racetrack, it's going in loops, it's doing the same thing. In a strange way, it is static. It's stuck in this kind of focal point, right? Because it's going around and around the same point over and over again. It's not really going anywhere. And that, of course, doesn't help people be prepared for change. So whenever change happens, once again, going back to the more extreme cases of death, because that seems to be the thing that really rocks people's worlds the most, suddenly they have no idea how to engage with this. Even though death is a fundamental part of human life. If we're alive, we're going to die. That's just how it is. And so many people are so completely unprepared for that. So living and transforming through our lives actually, in my experience, really does help us prepare for death. That we've been living fully. We're not still looking for fulfillment. We found it already. so that we can come to a true completion with life. And what a beautiful thing. How often do people get to come to a true completion with life when they pass on? I don't know. But this flow definitely will guide us towards that, because this is part of embracing humanity, our humanness. Once again, if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to ask. I've got about 15 minutes left, and if, not too many people have questions tonight, I may wrap up a little bit early. And going back to the intelligence of this flow, particularly after awakening. After awakening, it's amazing. It really does feel like the way a seed is sprouted, and you're just growing in all sorts of different directions, and you're resting sometimes, and then you're expanding, and you're doing all these different things almost without volition. But the more we drop into that as an awakened being, the more it really does also feel like you. So the way I've been talking about this tonight has been primarily dualistic, in the sense of like this, there's still kind of this I, this ego self, and then there's kind of this divine flow. But as we let go more and more ego, we really do just become that flow. And there's a quality of guiding it that we access, but it's just so completely different. So completely different than any way that we think as an ego. So I'm not even going to really go into that. Just to say that it exists. That there's this profound surrender to this intelligence, to this flow. We do also find a certain level of choice. And we're just so much more clear about the impacts of our choices. The ego is such a blind tool. It doesn't understand itself. It doesn't understand usually that it even exists or it could be changed. And it often has no idea about the impacts of its choices. And we see this all the time in society. What's more important is that you see it within yourself. That you begin to understand the choices you make and the impacts those choices cause. The ripples they cause in different people in your life. If you do not understand that, then you're still blind about yourself. As I said earlier, depending on where you are on your spiritual journey, doing inner work is really important. If you haven't had a strong spiritual awakening that's forcing you to do this work, and once again, that's a very rare thing, and it really does force you to do it 24/7, but a lot of people resist that too. So the more resistance we get lost in, the more things just will stop again. And we'll just get back to driving around in the same circle. That's why we have to be dedicated. Have to break out of these loops, to forge off into the unknown, into places that will challenge us, that will trigger ego fears of all kinds because it's new to us, because we don't know how to behave. We don't know if we'll get what we want. But life, when you're really present, is always unknown. We don't know what's going to happen in any moment. And we surrender to that lack of knowing, and we flow into it. We flow into it willingly. And we engage whatever enjoyable or unenjoyable things come our way. I think that's all for tonight. You can join me all again in 2 weeks at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. I'll be talking about choosing to be a spiritual teacher or leader. I've touched on this subject before in other videos that you can search on my channel, which is Jim Tolles here on YouTube. But I felt like coming back to it because I know many of you really care about that path and see yourselves on that path. As always, you can find my latest stuff on spiritualawakeningprocess.com. Have a beautiful morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you may be. Lots of love to you all. Goodbye.